Genesis 15 and 13. 400 years of mistreatment in a foreign land. Was the prophecy of Genesis 15 and 13 fulfilled with the children of Israel, Egyptians sojourning in bondage? Genesis 15 and 13. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. In this chapter, Yah made a promise to Abram, who later became Abraham, concerning his seed. Yah says, Know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Scholars and the Bible experts point to this prophecy as being fulfilled when the children of Israel spent 430 years in Egypt. But if we closely examine what Yah actually said, we'll see there's no more of this. The Hebrews walked into Egypt. Rather, they were brought in Egypt with Pharaoh's own wagons. Genesis 45:19 to the 21st verse and 27th verse. They were not slaves, and they were not mistreated at all. At this time, Slakia, Joseph was the viceroy because of this, and he held a favorable position among the Egyptians. Genesis 45 and 18 to 24 verses. The Bible tells us that the oppression of the Hebrews began after Joseph. All his brethren and the entire generation that entered Egypt died out. Then there was a population growth among the Hebrews. Exodus 1 and 6 to the 11 verses. Scripture also says that Joseph lived for 110 years. He saw his son Ephraim's children of the third generation, and the children also Machir, the son of Manasseh. Joseph's other son were brought up on Joseph's knees. Genesis 50, 23rd and 26th verse. Joseph lived long enough to see his great-grandchildren. The children of Israel were only in Egypt 430 years. In order for the prophecy in Genesis 15 and 13 to be fulfilled, they would have to have been oppressed for 400 years. So this means that after 30 years of being in Egypt, the evil treatment should have begun. But the fact that 30 years after the arrival, they were still in good favor with the Egyptians. As stated that the oppression after Joseph died, Joseph's death took place well after the first 30 years in Egypt. Also during the time of Joseph, the Hebrews were still treated well by the Egyptians. The evidence for this can be found in Genesis 50 and 26 verse. We are all told that Joseph was embalmed and put in the coffin in ancient Egypt. Embalming the coffin burial was reserved for royalty and members of Pharaoh's court. And the rich. So this tells us Joseph was still in good favor with the Egyptians when he died. And if Joseph was still treated well by the Egyptians at his death, so were the Hebrews. Exodus 1 and 8 says, Now these rose up a new king over new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. This was a very profound statement because Joseph was second in charge to Pharaoh. Exodus 41 and 42 verse to 44 verse. Being viceroy would make of Joseph very popular and a well-known man throughout the land of Egypt, particularly in the house of Pharaoh. Ancient Egyptian history tells us that one could only claim the Pharaoh's throne if, number one, he was the son of the Pharaoh's a prince. He was a high ranking. That's number two. He was the high ranking member of the king's courts. Number three, he was another male member of the Pharaoh's family. If a coup took place, that's number four. Any case, the next Pharaoh would have known who Joseph was because Joseph was also in the king's court knew all of the king's sons and all of the high-ranking members and all of the Pharaoh's male family members. Scholars have stated that Joseph and the Hebrews were in Egypt when a people known as the Hyksos were in charge. They tried to make a point that the Hyksos were the ones showing favor to the Hebrews, not the native Egyptians. The Hyksos, also known as shepherd kings, did conquer and ruled Egypt for over 200 years. Their domination of Egypt was known in Egyptian history as the Great Humiliation. And if we look deeply in the scripture, we will find that Egyptians, Joseph's time, were in fact native Egyptians. First, let's consider the conversation that Joseph had with Hebrews who were first arrived in Egypt. He was instructing them how to respond to one Pharaoh's questions. In verse 34 in Genesis 46 and the 31 to the 34 verse, Joseph said to them, "When Pharaoh asked the occupation, that ye should say, you servants' trade have been about cattle from your youth even unto now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians." This statement alone proves that the Hyksos were not in charge of Egypt during the time of Joseph. The Hyksos were known as the shepherd kings or kings of the shepherds. So why would every shepherd be an abomination to the shepherd kings? But every shepherd would have been an abomination to their native Egyptians because of the shepherd kings. Hyksos had brought great humiliation to the Egyptians. Next, let us look at what happened after Israel. Jacob, known as Jacob, died, and the thing that Joseph had done to his body. Genesis 50 and 22 and 3rd verses. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. And the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were fulfilled for him. For so are fulfilled for so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed, and the Egyptians mourned for 70 days. Embalming was a practice of the native Egyptians. They were the first culture on the earth to embalm their dead. The embalming was not done to all population of Egypt, just a select few. The practice of embalming was something done by a highly developed society. The Hyksos, on the other hand, were shepherds. Embalming was more than likely not in their culture. So if the Hyksos were ruling Egypt during the time of Joseph, why did they retain Egyptian culture? When a nation conquered another nation, the conqueror always places their culture, society, their culture above. They always place their culture above that of the conquered nation. Salakia for that one. Okay. The practice of embalming was something done by a highly developed society. The Hyksos, on the other hand, were shepherds. Embalming was more likely not their culture. So if the Hyksos were ruling Egypt during the time of Joseph, or Yosef, whatever you want to call it, why did they retain Egyptian culture? When a nation conquers another, the conqueror always place their own and culture above of that conquered nation. Okay, I just read that. All right, let's read on. This is one way that the conqueror shows that superiority over the conqueror. This has always been the case in ancient and modern times. This is exactly what happens with the invasion of the Americas by the Europeans, because these Egyptians were still embalming. According to native Egyptian culture, it stands to reason that the native Egyptians were ruling. Scripture clearly shows that the Egyptians were ruling Egypt during the time of Joseph and the Hebrew sojourn. Now back to my viewpoint of the new king coming into power and not knowing Joseph. In order for this to happen, a few pharaohs had to come to power, and with each of them a new viceroyal government. This means that after Joseph's death, enough time had elapsed where Joseph's memory in the house of Pharaoh was long forgotten, and the Hebrews were no longer seen as good neighbors, but a foreign threat. This is not hard to believe. Ask the average citizen of your country who was in power at the time of the 20th century. Who was second in authority? Many, if not all people, including government officials, will not know the answer. Many years had passed. Joseph his good deeds were long forgotten. How much time had elapsed? We can only speculate, but we can assert that it was more than 30 years of the 430 that they have spent in Egypt. Many years that have passed in Joseph and his good deeds were long forgotten. How much time had elapsed, they would say. Elapsed, and we're only speculating that, but we can be assured that it was more than 30 years of the 430 that they spent in Egypt. The Hebrews' oppression in Egypt did not last 400 years. Exactly how long did it last? We can only speculate that as well, but we do know that if it lasts no less than 80 years. This was the age of Moses when the Hebrews were liberated. Israel was in slavery for the time Moses was born to the time that they were freed, which was 80 years. Acts 7:6 says that the Hebrews will be brought into bondage into a strange land. Those that bring them into bondage will be entreated them evil 400 years, meaning no more than 409 years and no less than 309 years. If we put this with the other information that has been presented on this site, we'll see that the prophecy was fulfilled with the advent of the transatlantic slave trade. Any good black history book will tell you that the only Hebrews, so-called blacks, have been mistreated continually for over 400 years. If every form of racism, including slavery, lynching, segregation, Jim Crowism, and the list goes on and on, it has been non-stop oppression, which still continues today. The Hebrews were brought into this hemisphere as slaves in the 1500s, which was over 400 years. If this prophecy of being in a strange land 400 years and being treated evil didn't happen in Egypt, then where? The only feasible answer would be the Americas. This strange land that is not occurs. This is where we have been afflicted continually for 400 years. And treated. This is we've been continuing for 400 years. Acts 7:6 tells us that the Hebrews were to be brought into bondage. Ancient Yisrael was not brought in bondage into Egypt. They also brought the bondage, and they as I already mentioned, Salakia for that one, and were in a good favor with the Egyptians of Joseph's day. They lived peacefully with them in the beginning and were not made slaves until much later. Only the Hebrews of the Americas were brought into the bondage, into the strange land, and entreated evil for over 400 years. No other group can prove that this happened to them just as prophecy said it would. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, 32 verse 1 and 6 states, thereof, hear, O Abraham, see, behold, your seventh generation shall go with you, and they will go out into an alien land, and they will enslave them and oppress them as for 1 hour of the impurest age. But of the nation whom they shall serve, I am the judge. And the Almighty also said, have you heard, Abraham, what I've told you, what your tribe will encounter in the last days? Abraham have heard, except the words of the Almighty in his heart. The prophecy of Genesis 15 is to be fulfilled in these last days. It was not fulfilled in Egypt. 400 years and Genesis 15 and 13 is not exceeded 499 years. That's a long time. We have been here for over 400 years, not exceedingly 500, not less than 399. We are not owners of this land. We are only citizens. If the rulers decide we can no longer be citizens, what will stop them from deporting us to some other place? I only say that so you, the reader, will understand how Genesis 15 and 13 was prophecy for the latter days in which we are living now. Yeah, this is information I found recently. It's called angelfire.com. More curses. So this is Genesis 15:13, 400 years of mistreatment in a foreign land. So with that, I want to say, may Yahuwah bless y'all many times. All I want to say is shalom, shalom.